Eric Alterman, I would like to welcome you to the public seminar Book Talks. Eric is a friend of mine and a distinguished professor of English and journalism at Brooklyn College at CUNY. A lifelong journalist, Eric also has a PhD in history from Stanford University and a master's degree in foreign policy too, which I hadn't known Eric before I looked it up. And he's the liberal media columnist for The Nation, the oldest progressive publication in the United States. Lying in State is Eric's 11th book, and Alterman watchers can consult his work for everything from the history of liberalism to foreign policy to city government and the effects of the punditocracy on the news we get. And Eric's book on pundits was incredibly useful for my own recent book, and I recommend it to everyone who wants to know why the news is so lousy nowadays. But today we are here to talk about Eric's new book, Lying in State, Why Presidents Lie and Why Trump is Worse. And it could not be coming out at a better time. As I tweeted today, Eric, Donald Trump on August 14th told the New York Post that actually New York State was now a swing state and it was in play for Trump. And the New York Post being who they are, pumped it out like, as I said, sludge from a water treatment plant. As it turns out, on that day, Biden was over 25 points ahead of Trump in New York State. So we really need to focus in on lies, even more so than we have the last 4 years. And Eric, since I creeped your webpage, I noticed that you're now working on a new book about radical journalist I.F. Stone, otherwise known as Izzy Stone. So I want to begin with a small homage to him, which must have been in your mind as you conceived this book. Izzy Stone famously said,
so you don't go too far with it.
Excuse me?
I wrote the introduction to the republication of a biography of Izzy Stone.
Got it. Okay, introduction to a republication of a biography of Izzy Stone. So Izzy Stone famously said, all governments lie. So Eric, if lying is a foundational government activity, why are presidential lies so consequential?
Good question. Before I answer it, I'm sorry, it sounds a bit like the Johnny Carson show, but I want to tell you how grateful I am to be here and how I want everyone to know, at least in my not so humble opinion, that I'm being interviewed now by a heroic figure, someone who not only has just written a great book about alternative journalism and with an excellent chapter on I.F. Stone, as it happens, but also who keeps up this idea of being an engaged scholar, first via Twitter and now via this website and the magazine you publish. And it's just exactly, I mean, I don't agree with you a lot, actually, come to think of it, but it's just you're just a model of what I think a scholar who cares about her community and her country should be. I can't think of a better example, and I'm so grateful to take advantage of that today. But also, I want to take a moment to stop and recognize that, because it's a small world, and you don't really get rewarded for it. In the worlds you and I live in, you're either a journalist or an academic. The worst thing you can say about an academic is that, oh, it's just journalism. And the worst thing you can say about a work of journalism is, oh, that's history. And yet the two need to be treated in tandem, or they fail to inform, they misinform, they disinform. And so I just want to point to you as an example of someone who's living that. And I am
kind.
Okay. Now, as to your question, it's a good question. I haven't been asked it before, but I have an answer. The answer is that presidential lies are consequential acts in ways that other lies are not. Presidential words are things that matter. They can't help but matter. Actually, I'll say that they matter, they can't help but matter up until a few weeks ago. Because recently, I saw something that would have been amazing had we not lived through the past 3 years, and it's still kind of amazing, which is that after the explosion in Beirut, Donald Trump said he talked to some really great generals, and they were pretty sure it was that was a bomb that had happened. And so the president of the United States said that Beirut had been bombed and all these people had been killed. And nobody said, oh, we have to find out what did the bombing and what we need to do about it. They said, oh, it's that moron in the White House who you can't believe a thing he says. And everybody just ignored it. The president's words that could, in previous times, have started a war just were completely ignored. Mm-hmm. So Trump is a new era in presidential lying, and I'm sure we'll get to that. But if you had asked me this question before, up till say 2017, 2018, I would have said that when presidents lie, it creates its own reality. And the lie is reported as true because the media are extremely uncomfortable in reporting that a president has lied, even when they know that the president has lied, for a lot of reasons, and we can talk about that. And so what happens is that the president has to keep lying, because whatever it was he's lied about is still a problem. It hasn't changed. But he's addressing the reality he's created with the lie. So if you look at like Lyndon Johnson in Vietnam, he kind of lied accidentally the very first time about the Gulf of Tonkin, that incident that never happened. But he had to stick with his lie, and he keep lying and lying and lying to protect the original lie, to say that we were winning, that everything was going great, that we were protecting democracy, that only communists would call into question the truth of the president. And in the meantime, we were losing, and the whole thing was going to hell. And by the time it became obvious that the president had been lying, back then it was called a credibility gap, to avoid the word lie, the war was lost and millions of people were killed and the country was in turmoil. And that's an example of presidential lie that created its own reality and ended up destroying the presidency itself.
Mm-hmm. No, that's really interesting. And I think the idea of the president, particularly as a global figure, and really, you know, after 1945, what American presidents say reverberate around the world in critical ways. So let's get to what a presidential lie really is. You define a presidential lie as, and now I'm quoting from your book, purposely misleading the country about a matter of political significance. But that last category is really broad, and I think your book really shows historically how broad it is. It covers the founders' commitment to the institution of slavery, but their failure to actually speak about it honestly. It covers withholding, reframing, or falsifying information about foreign policy matters. It covers concealing health problems. It covers sexual affairs. Is there any difference between these lies? Do some of these lies matter more than others?
Well, sure. I mean, if it's been up to me, I wouldn't care about sexual affairs. I wouldn't care about the president's personal behavior at all. That's not part of the job, in my view. It's become part of the job because we live in a tabloid-driven culture that is personality-based. I think it was healthier in the days where presidents could do what they want behind closed doors, and as long as they carried out the job of the president. But those days are clearly gone. Look, lying is a part of politics. Like money is a part of politics. It's good to reduce the amount of lying in politics, and it's good to reduce the amount of money in politics, but you can't get rid of them, period. You have to accept a certain amount of it. And so it becomes a matter of deciding what kinds of lies you can live with and what kinds you can't. You know, if the president comes to Topeka, Kansas and says, I'm really happy to be here, he's probably lying. You know, we can live with that. If he says he doesn't really want to run for president, but he's willing to accept the enthusiasm of his supporters, okay, we can live with that. For the first 150 years that I studied to write this book, it became clear to me that there were two kinds of lies that American presidents told that were categorically different from kinds of lies you might tell if you were the French president or the Brazilian president or any other president. Actually, Brazil is not the best example in this case, but a Colombian president. One had to do with the need to maintain white supremacy.
Mhm.
So as you mentioned, slavery, getting the Indians out of the Native Americans out of the way so that we could do what we wanted. Going into Latin America for economic reasons, and then the Philippines, Puerto Rico, which happened at the same time in the Philippines. We were not prepared to admit these people as citizens, as equals. And the reason is because they were not white. Slavery obviously was based on this, and so was the way we treated Native Americans. But we have a Declaration of Independence where the first sentence, I believe, is all men are created equal. And certainly it's what we teach our children. It's what presidents have to say in their speeches, some version of that. And so the only way to marry this actual behavior and the myth is to lie. And that's what presidents have always done up until maybe Jimmy Carter. Secondly, and this is related, these two structurally forced lies are they're impossible to separate. Is the need for expansion, empire, and what we now call national security. America began expanding almost immediately after it was founded. Under President Adams, enormously so under President Jefferson, again under President Monroe, again enormously under President James K. Polk, who there's a fascinating fight between James K. Polk and Congressman Abraham Lincoln, who played a heroic role in trying to hold the presidency to the truth in a matter of war and peace, which turned out to be impossible. Lincoln gave up his seat because once he had done this, he had no chance of winning. And then once expansion ends in the late 1800s, when Frederick Jackson Turner, the great historian from the University of Wisconsin, declares the end of the frontier, which happens to coincide with the other great ideological impetus of the time, Manifest Destiny, which has quite a few mothers and fathers. I tie it actually to Alfred Thayer Mahan's thesis about the importance of sea power, because you lose the frontier, you have to save the world through Manifest Destiny. What are you going to do? You're going to go abroad with a navy. And that's what we did. We went abroad with a navy in Latin America, but most importantly in the Philippines. And we converted these people by killing them. We taught them that the best thing to be was what we were, which were Christian capitalists. And if they didn't want to be that, they died. And the most recent estimates I've seen for the Philippine-American War, more people were killed in that war than in the Civil War in the United States. And the Teddy Roosevelt's little coup in the Panama Canal, these things had to be lied about, because again, we are champions of democracy. We defend our liberty, and we preach that we are there to help other people find their own version of democratic government. But in fact, we are threatened by democratic government. This becomes even more evident during the Cold War, when other countries flirt with different forms of government that we don't approve of, or we think could lead them to ally themselves with the Soviet Union. In most of the coups that were undertaken in the 1950s and 60s, particularly Iran and Guatemala being the biggest examples under Eisenhower, there was no relationship at all between the Soviet Union and the governments we felt the need to overthrow. Also Chile. Chile had when that was overthrown during the Nixon administration with Henry Kissinger's strong support.
Right. Famous
Quote by Kissinger, and I'll shut up in a second. I don't see why we should let a country go Marxist due to the irresponsibility of its own people. In all three of those cases, there was no evidence at all according to our own intelligence agencies,
Right.
of a relationship between the socialist parties that won the elections and the Soviet Union. But the idea of a country choosing to be socialist was seen as a national security threat to the United States. Well, they had to lie. They had to say, we're saving them from the Soviet Union, rather than, we don't like the idea of them taking a form of government that's different from ours.
Well, and part of what becomes complicated about that, which I think your book shows very, very beautifully, is that lies create ideological constructs that then provide evidence that the lie is true. So you end up in this sort of warped situation in which ideas like manifest destiny, for example, which are a lie, then create, they sort of spawn a whole set of other ideas, like the idea that Indians have vanished, that they've just sort of gone somewhere and there's all this empty land to take up, and so on and so forth. But the actually supporting the lies elaborates on an ideology that then spawns more lies.
Well, yeah, this is an interesting and complicated question that we need a forum like this one to discuss. On the one hand, I accept the fact that people live in their own time. You have to. So to not treat Native Americans as equal to whites, we know that's a lie, but it's not, you can't get that excited about it, since it was a lie that you would have had to be, Noam Chomsky of the day not to believe. It was an accepted lie, it was an unquestioned lie. Even so, Andrew Jackson told a lot of lies in that context. He knew that the treaties that he was signing were not going to be upheld, and that they had no intention whatsoever of treating the Indians as badly as they promised to treat them. There's a quote, a Republican senator at the time, who said, "We don't have to adhere to these treaties because they're not signed by Christians, and if you're not a Christian, you can't give an oath, so they're meaningless." So I had to try and decide in what sense people were lying, given what were the common beliefs of the time. I mean, I actually think in the time we live in today, people years from now will decide that we're living a whole set of lies, even as we try to be as honest about them as we can. So making these distinctions is difficult. Jefferson fathered 1, possibly 6 children with his slave, who was very young when they began. I don't know what word you use for what they had, their relationship, because calling it an affair between a slave owner and a slave is really not fair to the slave. Although she seemed, again, I'm not qualified to go deeply into that. Everyone should read Annette Gordon Reed on that topic, and not me. But I don't say that Jefferson lied because he thought because he treated his slave as his mistress, because that was understood by everyone to be totally cool. That's what slave owners had the right to do. What he lied about, but he nevertheless lied about it because, while it was understood in his social circle, and John Adams even wrote a poem about it. It was so funny that he was having this, whatever relationship was. He still felt the need to lie about it. So there's this guy, this journalist, who's an incredible figure in history. He's the guy who blackmailed Alexander Hamilton about his affair with. Well, he wrote about it. He didn't. It's not the blackmail, but he wrote about it. But he also fought Jefferson, and he was. He went back and forth between making all politicians of the time miserable. And so Jefferson denied the fact of the affair. That was clearly a lie, no question about it. Throughout history, until Annette Gordon Reed proved it, for hundreds of years, people couldn't believe it. They couldn't. There's the famous historian I quote says, "If Jefferson is wrong, then America is wrong." Well, he was right,
Right.
but for the wrong reasons.
Well, and actually the idea of Jefferson as an honorable man then produced the lie that he didn't lie.
Right.
And for our audience here, you know, Eric and I think we both recommend Annette Gordon Reed's work on this. There's also a wonderful, wonderful article by Jan Lewis, who has now passed away, called The White Jeffersons, which argues that Jefferson's white children knew that he had Black children, and part of how they expressed their love for their father was pretending that he wasn't lying. But she makes a much bigger argument that actually all families lie about themselves. It just depends, you know, what the lie is.
Yeah, actually, I like that argument. It's an
Yep.
argument that's made in Don DeLillo's White Noise, that that's what
Yep.
families are for, to lie to each other
Yep.
in order
Yep.
to protect themselves from the horribleness of the
Yep.
world.
I have a little message from my friends Brian Case and Michael Shaw, who are running this webinar. Thank you, Brian and Michael, for your work. I want to remind the guests that there's a Q&A button if you navigate to the bottom bar. There's a Q&A button where we can begin to queue up your questions, which we will go to in about 15 or 20 minutes. I want to push Eric on a couple of things before we do that. Because you argue in the book that it doesn't matter why someone lies. What actually matters are the effects of those lies. And I wanted to ask you, you know, as the book progresses, we see the aggregate effects of lies being passed on to new administrations. And you really make what I think is a very powerful argument that there is a smaller and smaller space for truth the further we move through the 20th century. And the presidents really have no choice but to continue lying and to maintain the lies of previous administrations. Are there other choices? I mean, was there a moment in which some president could have said, actually, no, I'm not going to maintain those lies anymore?
Well, it depends on the lie and it depends on the president.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on presidential lies, and that turned into my first book on the topic. It came out 16 years ago, which I draw on for this book. And I was inspired by this very question. I was inspired back then by the fact that Lyndon Johnson didn't know that John Kennedy had lied about how he solved the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that this had, I think, put him in a box and forced him to be much more aggressive in Vietnam, eyeball to eyeball, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Had he known that Kennedy had caved to the Soviets and was willing to cave even further, in my opinion, he wouldn't have felt trapped. And there's a lot of evidence of the punditocracy and other people, other politicians, including in this case Robert Kennedy, saying John Kennedy toughened it out with Cuba, and Lyndon Johnson had better do the same thing in Vietnam. That's kind of a broad example, because I can find a few examples of Johnson actually saying so, but there were a lot of reasons to be in Vietnam. A specific example, there are a lot of similarities between Kennedy and Roosevelt, by the way, was Roosevelt lied about Yalta. He lied about the deal he made at Yalta. He made one interesting historical similarity is that both Kennedy and Johnson, I mean, both Kennedy and Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, did very brave things in doing what I think are the right things to save civilization, literally. Roosevelt in the case of saving the world from the Nazis, Kennedy in the case of preventing nuclear war. And both wouldn't admit it. Both insisted that they hadn't done what they did because it involved lots of compromises, and they wanted to act as if they were just macho guys and had gotten what they wanted. So Roosevelt lied about all of the concessions he had been forced to make to the Soviet Union in order to get the Yalta Agreement. And it was a special situation because nobody knew whether or not the atom bomb would work. And he really wanted the Russians to come into the war against Japan. So he made a lot of concessions in Asia so that it would be less likely that millions of Americans would die in an invasion that was being planned. Perfectly reasonable thing to do, and a perfectly reasonable thing to keep it secret and lie about it in order to keep it secret. But Truman never knew about these secret deals. Roosevelt never spoke to him. He had no idea. Yep. He was treated with the same contempt, interestingly, that Kennedy treated Johnson.
Yep.
And so Truman was stuck with standing by Roosevelt's spoken position, which was that the Soviet was violating all of our agreements had made at Yalta, and you couldn't trust them. And this is, in my opinion, how the Cold War began. Roosevelt, that Truman, that the Soviet Union, for all of the horrors that Stalin committed in mass murder, stuck to the deal that he had made with Roosevelt. And the United States did not stick to the deal because Truman was caught up in Roosevelt's lies. And by the time he found out that he was wrong, he couldn't go back and say, oops, sorry, the President of the United States has been saying all this stuff, that's nonsense. I mean, it's a ridiculous story in this case. Number one, Roosevelt and Truman had virtually no communication with Truman as vice president. They had only met twice, never alone. And Truman didn't even know that Roosevelt was at Yalta when he was at Yalta, because it was secret. Second thing is, and this is even funnier or sadder, no one could find a copy of the Yalta agreements after Roosevelt died. The State Department couldn't find them. There were these secret agreements that were negotiated just by four people, the translator and the two leaders. Averell Harriman was the translator because he was a Russian ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Russia. And he was really anti-Soviet at the time. He had been living in the Soviet Union and they treated him really badly, and he wanted a Cold War. And so he misinformed Truman about what Roosevelt had agreed to, and no one could find the agreements. So when the Soviets took what they were entitled to, Truman had a heart attack, not literally, but Truman got all furious and created all this mishegas. And in fact, the Soviets were totally doing what they had every right to do. But by the time Truman learned this, he couldn't go back and say, oops. He had to say, okay, he had to stick with his argument. So in both of those cases, the president died. So that's a unique example, I suppose, although you can't have two different unique things, unique in their own way. Special examples, and their successors were trapped by their lies in ways that they could not escape, and the results were tragic. And again, it's sad and ironic that in each of these cases, the lie was about something that was actually quite honorable, but Americans had not been trained ever, maybe even not today, to accept any form of compromise. So we got lied instead.
Well, and what I think is interesting also about that piece of the book is in some ways, ironically, it upholds the conservative critique of Roosevelt's foreign policy, that, you know, Roosevelt gave it away at Yalta and sort of betrayed democracy.
Absolutely not. Absolutely.
Really? Okay.
No.
Respond.
Shame on you. No, look, Roosevelt had a very weak hand at Yalta. The Red Army had liberated all these territories. And so he made the best deal that he could. The United States was not interested in going to war so that Poland could have a representative.
Right.
So, and to be fair to the conservatives, in this one small matter, Roosevelt didn't really care about democracy in these places. He cared about creating a world order so that we wouldn't be drawn into another conflict like this one. So Yalta was about dividing up the world in such a way that made sense by the way that forces were left at the end of the war. And the end of the war left the Soviet Union in a very, very strong position because they had basically won the war with enormous, enormous cost. So Roosevelt made a pretty good deal. But he wasn't willing to defend that deal because he didn't get everything. He wanted to pretend that he had gotten everything he wanted. And so he pretended that he had protected democracy and self-determination in Central Europe and also in Asia, and he hadn't done that. That wasn't in the treaties. Right. So he didn't give anything away that the Soviets already didn't have. What he didn't do is say that. He didn't say, look, he didn't come back and say, look, I made the best deal there was. Right. So the theory that the conservatives said, there's two ways of making their case. One is that it was a purposeful sellout. Alger Hiss was there and he was working for the colonies, and that explains it. And the other one is that, well, Roosevelt was really sick and confused and he didn't live much longer, and everyone took advantage of him, including the quote unquote commies. I think he made a very good deal. What he didn't have the energy to do because he was sick and about to die was defend it.
Right. Well, I wanted to bring in that point about him being sick, because I think one of the things your book points up is that at two crucial turning points in the 20th century, the end of World War I and the end of World War II, presidents had severe health problems that limited their energy, limited their ability to work, and that in the case of Roosevelt in particular, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but it seems to me that you infer that keeping his disability secret, which journalists collaborated on and everybody around him collaborated on, that actually lying about his health became second nature, that he felt no obligation whatsoever to reveal the fact that he was failing, and he knew he was failing at the end of the war.
You know, I wouldn't put it quite like that. Presidential health was off the table all through this period. I mean, John Kennedy had much more serious issues that were never discussed. But I wouldn't put it on Roosevelt. I think that, I mean, there was a conspiracy on the part of the press to hide Roosevelt's polio. The evidence, not that he had polio, but they never showed him in his wheelchair, and they basically protected him because they thought it diminished him.
Right.
But it wasn't that had anything to do with his death or his diminished capacity at the end of his life. Those were separate issues, so which nobody knew about. So I don't think that's the case. Like, I mean, I talk about, I don't remember if it's on a long footnote or if I got it back, a whole series of presidential health issues that were kept secret on purpose and lied about. I think Grover Cleveland had one of the most serious ones in an operation out at sea. The Wilson case, though, after World War I, is a much more interesting case to me, anyway, because it's a case of a lie where the president didn't say anything. The presidency lied because Wilson was unconscious for weeks, and he signed legislation. I think he signed prohibition, and his wife and his doctor conspired to hide his condition from the country. And so for a couple weeks, the country was ruled by his wife and by the members of the cabinet that were let in on it. And this was very few people. And there were all kinds of rumors that he had gone crazy, that he had venereal disease. People knew that something was going on, but there was an understanding that the president's health was affront to his dignity and to the dignity of the country to discuss it. And so they got away with it. Now, again, one could make the argument, historians do, that the League of Nations would have succeeded had Wilson had, because he came off, he had a stroke, an ischemic stroke, I believe it's pronounced, I don't know, while campaigning for the League of Nations. And so he had to come back to the White House, and then he had a second. And so he had to give up the campaign. And during that period, the Republicans killed the American participation in the League. So one could argue that if the stroke hadn't happened, or if they had been honest and allowed the vice president to step in and campaign for the League of Nations, they could have reached a deal where we would have been in the League of Nations, and Italy wouldn't have been able to bomb Africa, and Hitler wouldn't have been able to rearm Germany, and the whole world would be a different and better place had the truth been known. I mean, most of the time, we would be a lot better off, I think, historically speaking, if the truth had been known. Not always. That's the problem. I can't say, my first book, When Presidents Lie, I said presidents should never lie. I'm not saying that anymore.
Right. So I want to ask you a question about Jimmy Carter. And our friend Rick Perlstein is in the audience, and I just want to tell everyone else in the audience that Rick is actually going to be on this show on September 9th. If you want to pencil that into your calendar, you'll get an email about it. But Rick had a similar question, so I want to jump to it because it's my question too. I felt like the chapter you could write a whole book about was the Jimmy Carter chapter. And very few people are as fascinated with Carter as I am, but you could have gone on and on about about Carter, and I would have been happy. And he comes in at this post-Watergate moment and really, in many ways, gets elected because he says to the American people, I will never lie to you.
Mhm.
And you say, actually, that turned out to be a problem. And, you know, I want to just sort of point to one moment in the Carter presidency, which only us geek historians would really think about, which is the malaise speech, in which, against all the advice of all the people around him, his staffers, Carter goes on television and says, there's a real problem in this country, and we care too much about material things, and we really need to get serious about addressing the problems inherent in American society. And it's a disaster, and it helps Reagan get elected. So why is coming into the presidency and saying you won't lie, how does that undermine him?
Where we have to clear up a few things here. Number one, if for you Jimmy Carter fans, my colleague in life, Jonathan Alter, we're colleagues because people always say, I loved your article in Newsweek to me. I don't know if they say to John, I loved your article in The Nation. John has a 700-page book coming out on Jimmy Carter. My very close friend, Kai Bird, who blurbed this book, has a book coming out on Jimmy Carter next year that I've read the draft of. And so I know everything there is to know about Carter at the moment that anyone would want to know. These are long books. Briefly to correct you, the malaise speech was well received. People liked it.
Okay, but
What they
by
didn't
his
like-
staff?
By the American people.
Okay,
Rick Hertzberg drafted that speech.
okay.
What they didn't like, Carter's popularity went up after the malaise speech. What they didn't like was he then asked for the resignation of every cabinet member. And he created a whole new cabinet, and that gave people the idea that there was chaos, and that it confirmed the argument that he was in over his head and that we needed a stronger hand to tiller. But the malaise speech, which again did not contain the word malaise in it, the word malaise, I think, was drawn from what's the historian's name from University of Rochester? Christopher
Lash.
Yes, from his book at the time. And Carter read it and made a big impression on him. And people got the idea that he had read it. And that's how it got its name, although the word malaise isn't in there. It's a very odd speech for a president to give. I'm slightly off topic here, because presidents are supposed to say, everything's great. A few things are not so great, but we're on our way to fix them. I've said a few times that one of the most critical things I've ever heard a president of the United States say is what I heard Bill Clinton say at his inaugural. I remember being on the lawn there, being surprised by the line, although it was an eloquent line, which is, there's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed by what's right with America. It's not true. It's a good line, it's not true, but also the idea that there's anything wrong with America is controversial. Anything wrong with America. And Carter basically said, we're screwed. You know, we're really in the soup. I'm not using bad language here, which in this case would be more appropriate. And it worked until he then overplayed his hand and fired the whole cabinet. Now, to tie that to the question I think you're getting at is, why was he so badly received? Why was he so badly treated? Did this have something to do with the fact that he said he would never lie and did a pretty good job of not lying?
And can I interrupt just for a second, because Rick has sent through a specific question, which I think this is the moment to throw at you. And Rick says, I've heard you argue that Jimmy Carter's lack of mendacity is why the establishment disliked him. So if you could frame in relation to that.
Yeah, you see, reporters, they liked liars. They wanted to be lied to, particularly with regard to this issue of national security. They understood that they were insiders and that they understood that Americans couldn't be told the truth because it was too dangerous to tell people what was really going on. We needed to overthrow these governments. We needed to go eyeball to eyeball with the Soviets when necessary. And this had to be done in secret, and only insiders were privy to this knowledge, and it made them feel good to be amongst those insiders, even if they didn't know exactly what they knew. Izzy Stone once said about Walter Lippmann, who he became friends with late in his life when Walter Lippmann became kind of a dissident himself. He said, very few reporters have ever been shown classified documents by a president and not come out of that meeting thinking that the president was a wise man and pursuing a wise course. Now, Jimmy Carter, he came to the office of the presidency, number one, saying, "I will never lie to you," which was a dumb way to put it. Even his mother said, Jimmy's going to lie. And he was setting himself up to be, first of all, the Washington establishment didn't like these Georgia Hicks coming down at all. And to be honest, the Georgia Hicks said a lot of stupid things designed to make people mad at them as well. Like they both came into town ready to hate each other, and they each found good reason. But the examples, there are a few examples I give where Carter was kind of expected to lie and didn't. The one I think I spend most time on occurred very early in his presidency, where shortly after he became president, it was revealed that the CIA had been paying, I believe it was King Hussein, it was head of Jordan at the time. I believe it was King Hussein at the time, with money and prostitutes and school fees, getting his kids into school and stuff, just basically taking care of King Hussein in a way that would dishonor him and his country if people knew. And they were about to print it on the front page. And Carter had said, as a candidate, if I find out that the CIA is doing anything that, he says, you won't be reading any stories in your newspaper about the CIA doing something that you find disgusting once I'm president, because that was the case under Nixon. They were shooting people and killing people and so on. There was a House report on assassinations that got a lot of attention. So Carter didn't really know that this was happening, and once he learned that it was happening, he stopped it. But it was still going to create a big problem between the United States and Jordan. And in fact, Cyrus Vance, his Secretary of State, was on his way to Amman on a long-planned trip, as the Washington Post was about to publish the story on its front page, which was definitely going to create a crisis in the United States and the Arab world and humiliate Vance while he was in the capital of the place where it was happening. So Ben Bradley and Bob Woodward went in to see Carter, and they said, and Carter said, you know, I wish you wouldn't print this story. I've stopped what's going on. And Vance Si's on his way to Amman, and it's over with. And I had nothing to do with it. Once I found out about it, it was in. And they're like, no, we're going to run it. We'll give you a day so you can prepare. And they said, unless it's a matter of national security. And any president in the whole world, anyone who could be imagined would be president, would say, yes, it's a matter of national security, of course. And Carter said, I'm not going to tell you how to do your job.
Yep.
So like he didn't take the one excuse that had been given to all presidents, and they were kind of asking him to please take. And so they printed it, and then Carter was furious because as citizens, they could have at least waited till Vance was not with the guy when he did it. That was kind of peevish. The story would have held a day. Yep. And he denounced them. And so in Woodward's book, where he describes all these incidents, he says Carter's a liar just like Nixon was a liar, because his tone in the meeting was very different than the tone with which he denounced them. Well, my God. Right. I mean, that's the enormous difference. And I think that you see there the beginning of this process of reporters being much, much tougher on Democrats and liberals than they are on Republican conservatives, because they're afraid of Republican conservatives. I mean, I have this very same Ben Bradley on the record saying, we went easy on Reagan. How did the country elect this nutcase? We felt ourselves to be at sync with the country, and we were not comfortable with that. So we went too easy on the guy, and that's how we got away with so many lies.
Right. So I want to bring in a question from a member of our audience, another member of our audience, Kathleen Hulzer, who asks, and I'm quoting, "Do you know or write about ways in which governments can dismantle the edifice of lies that gets more elaborate over time?"
No. But to continue, the short answer is no, I do not. This book is in many respects a book about the media and about how the media have empowered our politicians to lie, in particular the Republican Party. Donald Trump is a Frankenstein monster of the marriage of Republicans taking leave of their senses, beginning first with Ronald Reagan, taking another great leap forward with Newt Gingrich. Everybody should read our friend Julian Zelitser's book. And allowing Republicans to become this radical organization that, again, structurally you have to lie if you want to be a successful Republican politician. You can't tell the truth about global warming or you won't get anywhere. You can't tell the truth about the economy or about immigrants now if you want to get anywhere. That's the party that Donald Trump came into and built on that with his birther lie. And so you had a majority, if I'm not mistaken, the majority of Republican voters believing that Barack Obama was not born in this country at the time of the election. You had a very significant number of people, I'm not kidding, like 30, 40% of Trump supporters believing that Hillary Clinton was running a pedophile ring, pornographic pedophile ring in a Comet Pizza in Washington, D.C.
Right.
Thousands, maybe millions of people believe that. And I blame the media. I blame the members of the media. First of all, there's a whole right-wing media that promotes these lies and pretends they're true. Rupert Murdoch is the greatest villain in this story. But I also blame all of the respectable media for saying, on the one hand, Republicans say this. On the one hand, Republican leaders say this. On the other hand, Democrats say that, and refusing to take a position. There's a lot of examples in this book under the Obama administration of them trying to address this issue of Obama being born in this country, and they won't come out and say, this guy's lying. Republicans won't do it, and the media won't say, well, you're lying, you're a liar. I mean, if you won't say this is a lie, then you yourself are participating in the lie. We never hear that. For the first 3 years of the Trump administration, he's gotten away with the vast majority of his lies. You know, and if you, lately, of course, people know that he's a liar. The Washington Post has a count of 20,000 or more. But even when you catch him lying, he's still lying. Like everybody's saying Chris Wallace is a hero and Jonathan Swan is a hero for the great interviews they did. And compared to everybody else, yes, they're heroes. But if you watch those interviews, you can count up dozens and dozens of lies that Trump didn't get caught on. There's just, once you have a pathological liar as president, you need a whole new playbook. And we don't have one. We have the same old one.
Right. Well, and you make an argument in the conclusion of the book, which I think is very powerful. You actually reference Hannah Arendt and Arendt's argument about how the overwhelming number of lies is what destabilizes us. And I want to get to how Trump is worse in a minute, but I also want to ask you about Monica Lewinsky, because this seems to set the stage for a whole new era in presidential lying, because part of the liberal defense of President Clinton was that everybody lies about sex and that it's no big deal. But does that mean that lying in politics then sort of by osmosis becomes more of not a big deal because the stories about Clinton's sexual life were so tied into his political legitimacy?
Well, I think it was stupid of Clinton I think it was stupid of him to risk so much of what people had invested in him by having that affair. And once he was caught, it's understandable that he wouldn't want to admit it because it's so humiliating, but it was very costly to him not to just, he could have gotten away with apologizing and admitting it and moving on. I mean, ideally, I think it would have been better for the country if he had resigned because of what happened later, but that's with hindsight. I don't know. It's a complicated question you're asking me, and I'm curious actually to what you think about it. I mean, I do think that it was irrelevant to his presidency that he was having that and it was used to destroy the most progressive aspects of his presidency. The Clinton State of the Union address that had been written, the Monica Lewinsky story broke on just as the State of the Union was about to be given after he had been reelected in 1996, and then that's that time it was. And he wrote the most. He's like, okay, I've given the right wing everything I needed to give them in my first term. Now I'm going to give my people who elected me what they want. And he had all these programs that he was going to speak to, and they were still in there in the State of the Union, but they were dead on arrival because the politics were taken up by nothing but Monica. The story of Monica, by the way, it's unfair to call it. I do it too. It's not the Lewinsky scandal, it's the Clinton scandal. She was a 22-year-old girl,
right,
who I think has emerged to be a very admirable citizen. And her Twitter feed's very funny. Anyway, so Clinton gave his enemies a sword, and they stuck him in the heart with it. And the net result was that we didn't get any of the progressive legislation that he promised, and Al Gore was afraid to run on the Clinton record, and George Bush was elected, and he wouldn't have been had these things not happened. The impeachment process actually worked for the Republicans, even though they lost seats unusually in the election of 1998. They laid the groundwork for the Gore campaign to handicap itself by running away from the Clinton record. So it was very consequential. And we live in a tabloid culture that you can't just wish away. I mean, Gary Hart shouldn't have said, "Follow me." And Bill Clinton shouldn't have said, "I did not have sex with that woman, Miss Lewinsky." But, the right wing, Rupert Murdoch, he did two things at once. He created this right wing media, but he tied it to a tabloid culture that he brought over from the London tabloids, which, as we've seen, are far worse even than ours, or were anyway. And the two things happened at once, and they became inseparable. I was hired by MSNBC for the first 2 years that it existed, and I was on television every day with so-called friends, they used to call us. And all we talked about was this stuff, Clinton stuff. And I have to say, the standards of truth were very low. I couldn't attack them on the air as much as I like to. I did every once in a while. They didn't like being attacked by their own guy. But there would be a story out, Clinton allegedly did this. And I'm like, how do we know that? It's, tennis stars leaking stuff all the time. And they go, I don't know how we know it. It's just out there, and we have to talk about it. And this became more and more the case, and it overwhelmed to take our politics seriously.
Right. No, and it's something that's only been amplified by social media now, because the more something is repeated, it doesn't actually matter whether you say allegedly or not, the more it gets sort of imprinted in the public mind. I want to get to why Trump is worse. And to make that turn, I want to go to a question from Dorothy Snyder, who says, recently the Huffington Post senior White House correspondent, S.V. Date, asked Trump if he regretted the last 3 years of lies and it stopped the president cold. Should that moment show a way forward for the press? That is, asking how politicians feel about their mendacity on a personal level.
Well, that's not how I would do it. I don't care about people's feelings too much. I care about getting at the truth. What I want is a press that does its best to tell us the truth. I don't care. I don't want the press to say, Donald Trump said this and Joe Biden said that. I want a press, and I don't want, and then somewhere else says, oh, here's our fact checking. By the way, what Donald Trump said is nonsense. I want a press that says, Donald Trump says this, but it's false. And here's why he's saying what he's saying is false. And here's the likely consequences of ignoring the truth. This used to be the way that the European press operated. If you were in Europe or in England, you picked a newspaper that matched the way you saw the world. You read Le Monde or Figaro or Libération, and they said, here's the truth. They didn't bother with on the one hand, on the other hand. But our press grew up as a objective establishment press, supported by advertisers, who were not comfortable saying no to one side. So we got this both sidesism, false equivalence, and it's left to the reader or the viewer to decide what's true. But if you have one side, as we do now, that has no conscience about lying, and in fact can't tell the truth because they would be drummed out of the party if they did, then that model breaks down. And I think it has broken. I think it's broken down on the front page of the New York Times and the front page of the Washington Post and on CNN. Now, fascinatingly, the Washington Post is why we know that Trump has told 20,000 plus falsehoods. CNN has an even better reporter on lies. They hired this guy, Daniel Dale, who I've never met, never spoken to, but I'm a great admirer of. He has got the best single Twitter feed on Trump of anyone. And they hired him from the Toronto Star, and he follows Trump's lies. He's got a count. It's different count than the Post. It's not as high, but he follows him in context. So he says, this is the 300th time Trump has told this particular lie. And here are the situations in which he tells it and what he's trying to get away from. He's also quite funny and clever. Like he says, any story where Donald Trump quotes somebody calling him sir, it's a tell, he's lying. But he explains in his short tweets and short articles the context for Trump's lies. It's something you never get elsewhere. You just get he lied or he didn't lie. But at the same time that CNN is publishing Daniel Dale, they're publishing the lies, unedited, uncommented, and millions more people see them. And this, I'm famous or infamous for coming up with this notion of working the refs. I didn't come up with it. I'm quoting the head of the Republican Party in 1990, Rich Bond, who said, the idea is not that we think the press is so liberal. It's just if you work the refs once in a while, they'll throw you a call. Another quote that Rich Bond said in that same talk, if I'm not mistaken, was if you lie during a presidential debate, millions of people hear you. And then if you have to issue a correction the next day, a few people hear it. Well, that's Trump's genius. He's lying to millions and millions and millions of people, and he doesn't get called on it 99% of the time. And the corrections barely register. So that's Trump. To move to Trump for a second, Trump's genius is that he doesn't care that you know that he's lying when he's lying. That's what Lyndon Johnson, even Richard Nixon, lied a lot, but they pretended they weren't lying. They were lying on behalf of a goal. Trump doesn't particularly lie on behalf of a goal. He lies to make himself feel big for the next 5 minutes. And he doesn't, and it's not, there's no dishonor for him in lying. So he had a meeting as president with Justin Trudeau, and they were arguing about tariffs. And then Trump came out of the meeting and said, yeah, I lied to him. But what was the point of lying to the Prime Minister of Canada if you were going to then announce to the world that you had lied to him? That kind of undermines the lie. And yet Trump doesn't care. He's like the New York commercial real estate guy multiplied by 1 million, and he grew up with no sense at all. And if you had grown up and become as quote unquote successful as Donald Trump is by lying at every stage of your life, you would think it was a good idea too. And he's right. I mean, the guy has no qualification to be president. It's ridiculous. He doesn't know anything about anything, and yet he is president. Why? Because he's been so successful at lying and never being called on.
Right. Well, and that was some of the messaging actually last night at the Democratic National Convention, and Michelle Obama just said that in her speech on day one of the convention. He doesn't have it. He just can't do it. He's had enough time and he can't do it. Eric, we're at 1 o'clock, so we have to let you go and we have to let our audience go. But I want to thank you so much for doing this public seminar book talk. It's a great book. I want to show it again to our audience. You can buy it at your local independent bookstore, preferably. If you must buy it from Amazon, then buy it from Amazon, but buy it. It's a great book. It's a great way of just sort of shifting your view of American history to think about our contemporary problem, which is our president, who is a horrible, horrible liar and is killing us all. Eric Alterman, thank you very much for this. And we hope to have you back when you write your next book.
Thank you.
Okay.